Brian, welcome to the Easy Conversations podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm really excited to have you on. We've been able to chat briefly, and I've gotten a pretty good idea of where you've been, but it's definitely going to be interesting to talk about your experience today and understand why it's led you into the work you're doing. And what I'm really curious about is understanding this deeper level of communication that we've briefly touched on previously as well. But before we get into any of that, I do want to give you an opportunity to share with the listeners a little bit about yourself, what's brought you here, and yeah, anything you can share to help us understand your
Yeah,
journey.
the big thing is a lot of people struggle to communicate an idea clearly. And it affects not only their careers, it affects their relationships, it affects the world around them. And when you understand that everyone's on a battlefield in their own mind every day, most people don't understand how that works because, say, they've never been in the military like me. But I always say, when you understand how a battlefield works, you'll understand how to make your life work. And my whole framework, I grew up basically without a dad. So I didn't learn much of how to succeed or what to do right in life. I saw a lot of what not to do. But as far as my framework for thinking, it comes straight out of the United States Army. I was a infantry soldier. I was a team leader in an infantry platoon back during the war in Afghanistan. And I was there. I was injured a couple times. I was inside of a vehicle about a month after we arrived that blew up. We ran over an IED, a roadside bomb, set it on fire. I actually walked away physically from it, but I didn't know at the time I had symptoms of a traumatic brain injury from it. And then a few months later, a suicide bomber in Kandahar drove his minivan into my door of my Humvee and blew himself and his van into about a billion pieces. And I woke up face down, burned and bloody, laying in a ditch on the side of Highway 1 in Kandahar. And then I spent 14 months, a year and 2 months at Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio, Texas, burn treatment, reconstructive surgery, traumatic brain injury treatment, all kinds of stuff. A very long road to recovery. And throughout that time, I do remember a lot of therapists and counselors they made me go see. It was like they would say all kinds of things that, like, they're trying to do their jobs, but I was just very blunt and to the point. Like, how you feeling today? It's all I feel like shit. Or like they would say things like, "Oh, I'll bet you deal with this," or "Do you deal with that?" It almost felt like there were times when they were expecting me to deal with something that actually wasn't, maybe because it was a common thing for somebody in my position. But I've always been just very blunt to the point. That's how I am. That's how I communicate. I think that's worked greatly to my benefit with my ability to
Mm,
deal with the struggles of life, but also to communicate ideas. One of the things that people struggle with is a lot of times they're so close to an idea or their own thought
mhm,
that there's an assumption that other people know what they mean with however they say it. You can be a PhD and know how to talk and teach a class as a professor at a university. But if you're talking to first graders, you've got to really clarify what you mean and quit talking the jargon because there's insider lingo. There's ways we think of things when we're so close to and familiar with things that we tend to forget that other people, they're usually not there. And so when you are able to
mm,
communicate clearly, you can get way more done in life and you can have a way better life. Again, it goes back to like our mission planning. Yeah, every mission you ever plan in the United States military comes down to 5 paragraphs. It's not, and I'm talking from the platoon level to international NATO alliances across cross cultural militaries who speak different languages, all that. There's 5 paragraphs that dictate what is the mission, what is it not, and all the details. It funnels down into that. And so at this point, I have my own sort of battle plan that I abide by
mm,
when I communicate with people because it allows me, if we're communicating against an enemy who's trying to kill us and you and I speak different languages or come from different cultures and different ideas, we all need to know what's the one thing, what's the one mission, and what is your role and what is mine, and what's the plan if something doesn't work. And we all need to have a common understanding of that with all these things that have potential to be obstacles in between our communication. So that's why I say when you understand how a
mhm.
battlefield works, you'll understand how to make your life work, your marketing work, And yeah, communication runs everything. And it can also, and it
Yeah.
doesn't matter who's the most honest, because there are bad people who use very effective propaganda to accomplish things, not because they're necessarily good people, but because you can have a great message, but the person who's doing worse things in the world than you, if they're better at communicating and convincing people, they're going to win. It has nothing to do
Yeah.
with we have the more noble cause. Doesn't matter who has the loudest microphone with the most effective message and consistently.
Yeah, I appreciate that. There's a lot to explore based on what you've shared. Now, one of the things that immediately jumps to mind for me is when you describe if we look at our day to day and if it's like a battlefield, I think that could be overwhelming for people where that inherent fight or flight can kick in if you're constantly feeling like it's a battlefield. Now, I'm wondering, is that more to drive a sense of urgency and realize that, okay, I can approach this with that mindset? What do you really mean when you say approach it
Yeah,
as
I
a
don't say approach
battlefield?
it as a battlefield to say to make people feel a sense of scarcity or urgency. I say it because it's a framework for life that works. So, for example,
Mm,
in the battle plan that I use for, I've literally coached people in their lives, but I've also written marketing copy as a copywriter for companies. You basically, if you look at every person, you look at your daily life, whether it's your relationship, whether it's your career or your next business goal, you have a mission, like a very clear, we want to accomplish this, but there's an enemy in the way. There are literal obstacles that are
mm,
in the way that you have to overcome. Those enemies have what they call propaganda as one of the most effective weapons. It the
mm.
propaganda, that's the thoughts in your mind that talk you out of
Yeah.
doing the thing you need to do. Because if an enemy can use
Hmm.
propaganda to demoralize you, they might not have to pull out a gun and fight you. If they can
Right.
effectively do that, those are the doubts and the stories in our heads that we tell ourselves about the enemy that's in front of us that's causing our life to in some way be difficult. Then
Hmm.
every mission has a plan. There's a very simple mission plan. I
Right.
talked about there's like a 5 paragraph operations order in the army. I usually say have a 3 step plan, like 3 big steps. If this whole problem could be solved in 3 giant steps, what would those be? Now, each of those steps might have
Hmm.
72 steps within them that are smaller, but what are the big three? Because you can mentally digest that. You can look at that and go, okay, I can do those 3 things or stay focused because it's simple enough. That and other people can look at
Hmm.
those 3 things and go, oh, I know how to help you with that because they can comprehend it. So then you're looking
Hmm.
at, all right, who are those allies? Who are the people who can help you? The people who are qualified to help you with the particular thing. Because on a battlefield, it's not just you. If you're alone on the battlefield, you're the
Hmm.
first person to get killed or captured. So who are your allies who can help you get there? Then ultimately, what does victory look like? Like a mental picture. What does life now look like once we've won, we've accomplished the mission? And also,
Hmm.
what does failure look like? What does it look like if we fail, we don't accomplish it? Maybe you lose your house. Maybe you lose your family. Maybe, oh, in war, you lose your life and terrorists will videotape sawing your head off with a dull spoon and then put it on YouTube or send it home to your family. Very real
Hmm.
stuff that happens, even though that's graphic. I'm talking real here.
Yeah.
So, and that failure, that defeat image can often drive us further than our temporary motivation for accomplishing something that'll make us feel good. We'll do more to avoid things. It's said in human nature to avoid pain than to attain pleasure. And so, after you look at things like that, like those 7 or 8 steps I just talked about, which is basically the battlefield,
Yeah.
you just have to go, okay, with all that. And I write these down on on a 1 page piece of paper for people, and we map it out so it's so easy to look at. Then we go, okay, what's
Hmm.
our first next step? And that's what I call deploying, like your deployment. Once you jump out of an airplane, you can't get back in the airplane. So it's this is the
Right.
step where you got the allies, you made the plan, you know what you want, you know what you're up against. Now it's time to pull the trigger. And that's one thing a
Hmm.
lot of people don't. You're the best plan in the world, but if you don't do something, nothing happens. So that's a basic outline of the battle plan
Hmm.
framework. And I say that to say, again, to reiterate your point, it's not to get people to move and do something. It does that. But the purpose is that this is
Yeah.
a framework, a mental framework for life that can be used in a variety of ways.
Yeah. No, and I appreciate you breaking down the framework because that's very helpful. And even with myself, I'm able to visualize it. Now, going back to your military experience, and I do want to draw a parallel here. I am curious to understand because when you're on the battlefield, often you need to be able to, I look at it as sports as well, right? To know what you can obviously go in with your own plan, but sometimes you have to anticipate what the other side is going to do. Now, how are you able to reconcile like this whole notion, like you shared in your own experience, this suicide bomber? Like, how do you make sense of that? What drives the other side to do things like that? And is that something that's even part of the focus while you're out there? Is that something you guys plan for? And how do you make sense of it? What's going on in their
Yeah, I have
minds?
my ideas. Maybe I should write out my hypothesis on the psychology of the suicide bomber. Or maybe I can maybe go become friends with the guy who's really on the edge and maybe talk him off the ledge. I don't know. But I know there's a few things. And we talked
Yeah.
about how we're going to address some propaganda, and we'll probably get to that right after
Yes.
this because I think this ties into it.
Mhm.
First thing, people ask me all the time when they hear my story, what did you learn about life through that war and the
Mhm.
injury? And I say I learned 3 words, and those 3 words are people are crazy. People are fucking
Mhm.
nuts. We're human beings put in the right situation. Like, we would all do things that we don't want to think we do. We're not better than the bad
Mhm.
guys. We're just as savage given the right situation. It's an ugly truth, but it's
Mhm.
we're all the same. We're all human. So there is
Right.
that. Sometimes it's fear. There were times when, it was Taliban in Afghanistan. They would approach
Mhm.
farmers and people and say, "Hey, you're going to help us kill Americans, or we're going to rape and murder your family in front of you, and then kill you slowly." So it's what are you going to do? There's 50 of us, and there's 5 of you. Why are you going to comply? Are you going to
Mhm.
strap a suicide vest to your kid and send him into the marketplace, or are you going to watch us brutalize you and your family and then kill you slowly? That happens. There's
Mhm.
also propaganda where, hey, these people, they're here and they're evil. They're trying to kill your family, which was never the case. We were never trying to do anything to innocent people at all.
Mhm.
I never saw anything remotely close to that. Do bad things unfortunately happen with collateral damage in war? Yes, and it sucks, but it was never like, let's just
Mhm.
go kill this family because like that's not your typical American soldier. But
Right.
you would have narratives being told to people to fear us. We weren't looking for the villagers. We were looking for the guys who a lot of them weren't even Afghani. They were mercenaries sent in to
Mhm.
fight us in that land. And so we were looking
Yeah.
for them, not the people living there. We have no issue with those
Mhm.
people. Very hardworking
Yeah.
people just wanting to survive and live their lives. I have nothing. They're just like me. But so there's fear, which is infused into propaganda and narratives and messages. And one of the things about really effective propaganda, like that really like it's weird, but you can say the wildest stuff, but if great, I say great propaganda, effective propaganda always has at least a little bit of truth infused into it. If I make a statement, if
Right.
you and I don't agree with each other on something, and I make a statement that you and I would both agree on. You go, okay, we don't agree on everything, but you have a good point there. I do agree with that. If I can get an
Mhm.
inch out of you, I can take a mile eventually, or 10 miles eventually,
Mhm.
because it's
Mhm.
more disarming. And if you
Right.
feel more kinship toward me, more friendliness, even if we
Mhm.
don't agree, you're more likely to start to agree. And if that's the
Right.
story you hear constantly, it becomes more believable. And through repetition, it becomes almost normal. One of the best examples of this
Mhm.
is when I lived in South Korea and I was up at the demilitarized zone, the DMZ of North and South Korea, one of the most hostile borders in the world. One thing I noticed is that North Korea has these giant speakers all over facing south towards South Korea because North Korea is communist,
Mhm.
South Korea is not.
Yeah.
24/7 propaganda speakers in Hangul, which is Korean, about how North Korea is better and their way of life. Like, they're trying to convince people to their way of thinking. Now, I don't see it as very effective because it's all military up there, South Korean military, and they're very much against each other. But
Right.
with continuous propaganda, the thing is, over time, you will always be able to grab a very little small percentage, at least, of the people listening. Start turning them to your way of thinking. And it doesn't matter what your cause is, it's psychological. And it doesn't even matter your education level. There are people with multiple PhDs, advanced degrees, they're just as susceptible to brainwashing as a high school dropout or someone maybe who's a janitor.
Right.
Or sometimes the janitor
Yeah.
has a little more common sense and I see what's going on here and that's a no. And everyone else is just going along. So it doesn't even matter with
Right.
your education level. But there is a quote I would like to share with you. It's a variation. I tried to find it before we get on here, but this is a variation of it. And I'm going to read it to you, and then I'm going to tell you who said it. So basically, this individual said that countries are basically made up of a bunch of mental children. All right, so they're adults, but mentally, most countries are made up of mental children, children mentally speaking. It says the receptivity of the masses, how receptive they are to a message, is very limited. Their intelligence is small, but their power of forgetting is enormous. So bad things can happen, but people tend to forget very easily. And I say this about Americans. I always say Americans have short memories, which is not good. But so their intelligence is small, but their power of forgetting is enormous. In consequence of these facts, all effective propaganda must be limited to a very few points and must harp on these in slogans, short phrases, until the last member of the public understands what you want him to understand by what you're saying. Basically, it's basically saying most adults are mental children, and if you speak on a child level to them over and over again with a simple and consistent message, you will eventually start to turn them because they're basically too dumb to know any different. And this person wasn't wrong. Do you know who said this? Adolf Hitler.
No.
Adolf Hitler.
Yes.
And he wasn't wrong. This is how he galvanized Germany to his side and almost took over the damn world in the 1940s. Just what he did, he was able to do with propaganda. There's nothing good about the guy, but the thing with him that was really dangerous is that he was evil, but he was also smart. And that's a combination you have to look out for, because people who are evil, it's one thing if they're not very bright. And if they're smart and kind and good, that's a good thing. But every now and then you get someone who's smart and evil. That's where you get the Hitlers and the Mussolinis and the Stalins and the Maos and these people who just, they wreak havoc in our world. And so I know I'm doing a lot of talking here, but that propaganda I talked about in my battle plan, that's what's in here. You can have a person totally capable of not drowning in a 4-foot pool if they just put their feet down because they're 5 foot tall. But they think there's what's 100 feet under them, and so they're kicking and they don't put their feet down. If they just knew, hey, just put your feet down, they go, oh, it's like that.
Yeah, and I'm curious to understand from your perspective. I find often the individual who's perhaps trying to influence people in that way is also trying to elicit an emotional response.
Oh yeah,
right. If I'm able to tap into an emotional reaction within you, then it's easier for me to influence.
Yes. And I'll take it even a step further, because step one is speak to people on an emotional level. As a marketer and copywriter, I will tell you, if you're speaking only to the literal problem and not to the emotions of the problem that people experience, then your advertising is going to be less effective. You definitely need to speak to the emotions. But I'll go even further. You need to beneath the emotion. So if you have the surface level problem, then you, like the enemy, then you have the emotion caused by the enemy, like you're talking about. That's effective. But you can be even more effective and gain even more loyalty if you speak to what I call the patriotic purpose. Are you in America? Okay.
No,
okay.
Canada.
Okay. You'll remember this then. When 9/11 happened, everyone rallied around, the whole country was the yes, they're in Afghanistan, they're claiming responsibility. We have to go get him. We can't just wait for this to happen again. The messages
Right.
were things like, you have a right to not have to worry about an airplane flying into your house today. Like, your children should be able
Mhm.
to grow up in a community where they're not afraid of suicide bombers driving down their street. You
Mhm.
shouldn't have to be afraid of driving through Manhattan in New York City ever again. Like, you shouldn't have to live that way. Do you notice how I'm saying your kids have the right you deserve?
Mhm.
It
Mhm.
should or shouldn't be this way. Like, I'm speaking to
Right.
a belief system of how it should be, and the people hearing it,
Yes.
they agree or they want to agree and think of that ideal
Mhm.
as, yes, that's right. Even if you look at the American election, all right, I'm not going into politics here, but I'm going to say
Yeah.
there's some people who are like, I'm with her. That was Hillary Clinton's thing. It was all about her.
Yeah.
But what did Donald Trump say? This was 2 elections ago when Trump, the first time,
Yeah.
Trump, he had 4
Yeah.
words. It said, make America great again.
Yeah.
That is a deeply like philosophical, patriotic purpose statement. It's an idea that this place was once great and it's not anymore.
Yeah.
We can make it better again. And it wasn't just about like Hillary's thing. It wasn't just about I'm with her. It's all about her. It was about us. We can do this and
Yeah.
we have to. You shouldn't have to deal with this. He was using phrases like drain the swamp, referring to Washington, D.C. I mean, you got to give it to the guy.
Yeah.
He's very colorful with his language. I'm not condoning or supporting or against. I'm just saying there's, whether you like him or not, there's a reason he's won the elections that he has. And it's because he knows how to
Yes.
talk on this level. And I personally think he knows how to do it just because he's been doing it in business so long. I don't even know if he knows he's
Mm.
doing it. And I'm not comparing him to Hitler like some people. I think that's pretty extreme. But I'm also not saying he's like the
Yeah.
second coming of Christ, like the other people are saying.
Right.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
But I say that, I bring him up because he's a perfect example of what I'm talking about. Now, does someone like him
Mhm.
had the potential to become like a Hitler type? Totally. Is he?
Mhm.
Probably not. But so does someone who rises up on the other side politically. But I'm saying,
Yeah.
don't look at the
Yeah.
person, look at the messaging, look at the
Yeah.
narrative. And he's consistent with his narrative. It's all, everything is wrapped up in those 4 words: make America great again. It's this
Mhm.
idea. And here's how we're going to do it. And then people can go, hey, this is how I can help and be a part. And we can get our way. So you could put this
Mhm.
all on the little battle plan points that I talked about, and you can just
Yeah.
map it out and do it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And one of the things you've touched on in different ways is this whole messaging around us against them. And there's a lot of criticism, even with the American military, right? Whether or not there's propaganda for war. What are your thoughts around that? Because it does drive that wedge, right? That it's us against them. And so there's a lot of criticism around that. Is war really needed? You can make the argument, yes, at some point you do need to protect yourself, right? And send a message to the other side. But what are your thoughts around whether or not there's propaganda even on the American military side and around creating this narrative? And you're seeing that with some of the messaging Trump has too, right? It's like you said, make America great again. It's this, again, this idea of we're great, we need, and then there's these outsiders that are trying to make it worse. So
Yeah.
just some thoughts.
The us and them, and any
Yeah.
politician that doesn't use the us and them division won't win. With as much
Mm.
as of a kind of a shitty thing it is, it's the only thing that wins
Yeah.
elections. It's the only thing that wins wars. It's the only thing that convinces people. Because look at this. Like, I'm more in the middle. I just say, with most things in life, the truth is usually found somewhere more in the middle rather than on some opposite of 2 extremes.
Right.
There is a reason that during American elections, it's either Democrat or Republican that wins. They're polarizing. The independents, there's some libertarians that who are in the middle. They have way better common sense ideas, and it will be way better. But they're in the middle. They're not
Yeah.
extremists, and it's like extremists get rewarded. In at least in our society, Canada is probably similar because we're both Western society. So people who are in the middle, you when you I think it's some of the better place to be, but you're just not going to win.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I don't know the last time, I don't know if ever from recalling right now, if any independent has ever won a presidential election in America. I don't know that they have. Because when you
I
polarize
don't think
people,
so.
you get them, like you said, emotional. You can tap into their belief system and go, these people are going, even during COVID, it was like, oh,
Mhm.
you're not wearing a mask? Oh, you want your grandmother to die. Oh, come on. You're trying to kill your grandmother. Get real. What the hell? But that was an
Yeah.
extreme message. And then there was other people going, it's not real at all. It was real, so you can't say that. But if you're not wearing a mask, like you want to kill your grandparents, get the hell out of here. Like that's stupid.
Yeah.
But it was somewhere in the
Mhm.
middle was okay. But nobody looked at that. And nobody acted like the middle was
Yeah.
there. And that's what created such a problem. When you create problems, you destabilize and you can then grab for power and try to gain some more. And that's the problem.
Mhm. Mhm.
War is
Yeah.
very profitable for certain
Yeah.
people.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And that's the unfortunate part for sure. Now, expanding on that, right? So, one of the things I see in the mental health side of things, when people, as we're talking about the polarizing views, it's almost like black or white thinking. It's either this or it's that. There's no
Mhm.
in between. And that's when people experience a lot of mental health struggles because they can't accept one thing or the other, right? So, if I fail at a project, immediately I'm telling myself I'm a failure. There's no in between that, oh, okay, this didn't work out, but maybe I'm taking a lesson from this and I can apply it in the future. So you could see how it can create a challenging worldview if you have
And the
black and
problem
white
is there's
thinking.
no alignment with who you really are. Like, like you've been
Yeah.
taught to think if it doesn't work out the first time, you're a loser. But the reality is,
Hmm.
you might have to try something 10 or 15 times to narrow it down, work off the, whittle it down, get rid of the things that aren't working to get to the thing that does. And then it's amazing. But if you've been taught to
Hmm.
think if it takes more than 10 times, you're a loser, it won't work. It's that old, was it Thomas Edison quote? He goes, trying to invent the light bulb. He's like, I'm not a failure. I just tried 10,000 ways that did not work. But after those
Right.
10,000 plus ways, like he eventually perfected it and we have lights now. But if he had the mindset of, oh man, it's like the 5,372nd time, it's still not working. Like, I'm such a loser. I'm stupid. This is a dumb idea. Whoever would, like, nobody had even thought about electricity at that point in history. Like, it wasn't a thing. This was like, he was like, hey, I'm going to climb to the moon. Like, how are you going to do that as far as believability?
Yeah.
But then he did it. And then he's
Yeah.
not an idiot. Then he's not a fool. Then he's a genius. So remember that with
Hmm.
your own mental health.
Yeah.
But nobody knew something is good at something immediately. Is I with copywriting, I can
Yeah.
write very compelling, good, strong messages for companies, but I've spent literally 5 or 10,000 hours of my life over the past 17 years doing it almost every day and for different
Hmm.
types of companies and organizations. So, like, it's wired hard now. I'm way better. Like, you
Yeah.
can't buy that from me. Like, you have to put in the reps if you want to do that. And it's the same thing with
Of
mental
course.
health though. So don't think because we mess ourselves up, I think, more than anybody. We listen to the propaganda, which is what that is. Oh, it didn't work. I'm a loser. No, you just found a way that didn't work. Now you can go, okay, that way doesn't work. So maybe one of these other 5 ways will. And then you get to the point where maybe you figure something out. And then you're like, oh, I just have to try hard enough and keep trying. And oftentimes I can make something happen. And that's very powerful to know about yourself.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. No, I agree with you. Now, I do want to explore a bit more on the military side because I'm really curious. You're talking about collateral damage, and unfortunately, that is what happens in war now. So, if you're on the other side, you've lost your family. It's an easy target now to know who the enemy
But
is,
now I have
right?
a reason to call you my enemy,
So,
even if it was by accident. And who wouldn't?
yeah. So, like, how do you navigate that? Because I'm always wondering, right? Because they talk about it quite a bit in war that you're indirectly now giving rise to terrorism because that person now who's lost their family, they really have nothing to live for. And you can make the argument they still have something to live for. But that person is now easily influenced by the propaganda on the other side that, look, these are the enemies, they killed your family. how do you navigate that piece and try to minimize it,
One way,
mitigate it?
and one way is to fight
Or
fire with fire, because we could point to a lot of villages that Taliban terrorized and brutalized for a long time. And we were actually good guys who brought in food and supplies and helped them and gave their kids and their families medical aid. And our propaganda could be, look, bad stuff happens and we're human like you. We hate that. But
yeah,
we're also good people like you are. We don't want your families caught in the crossfire. We're trying to get the same people you're trying to get. And it's understandable on either side. If there was a foreign military in my backyard and my family got caught in like a bomb dropping or some crossfire, I'd be pissed off and hurt too. And you can't not be. Now,
mm,
what's gonna be the difference? The difference is gonna be if I consistently receive only one side's propaganda about how bad the other side is, long enough, strong enough that it's just a normal thing. They're all devils and demons. Whereas if the other side's going, no, that wasn't what we were trying to do. Yes, that happened and it's unfortunate and we feel for you like any human would.
yeah,
But we're trying to get the same bad guy who brutalized your family for the past 40 years because that warlord was in charge of the territory where your village exists and is located.
mhm,
And the more we show up and are nice to their kids and give them medical aid, give them school supplies, supply food and things where they can be more sustainable.
mhm,
Pro- my propaganda plus my actions showing I'm not just saying we care, I'm bringing you stuff and I'm asking nothing of you in return.
mhm,
You are going to win hearts and minds doing that, especially
yeah,
over time. So it's like, how do you fight the propaganda on one side? You fight it with better and more consistent propaganda on your side. Now, here's the scary thing:
right,
some of the best liars write the best propaganda. And they can make out,
yeah,
if you've ever met a true narcissist, not the kind people throw that word around because like they
yeah,
disagreed with their boyfriend or something, but a real toxic narcissist, a real deviant person, the epitome of gaslighting. If you're doing something
yeah,
very crooked to someone, and then when they push back, you accuse them of doing to you what you're actually the only one doing to them. And then they believe you because they're human and susceptible, and most people are. You can write a narrative around that to keep them feeling bad, even though you're the only one who was actually doing the bad thing to them. They weren't doing it to you, but because you're a better liar,
yeah,
you can get away with it sometimes. And so it's not that
mhm,
either side in whatever the situation, war or politics, it's not that either side is so noble. It's all perception. Like, oh, like who's more
yeah,
noble? Whoever you think is based on what you're seeing and hearing and what your perception is of that. That's why I don't trust any of the news
mhm,
sources because they all have their agendas.
right,
And if one side gets really loud and crazy, this side has to get even louder and even crazier because you have to one up them. And so
mhm,
who's actually telling the truth? And then there's financial incentives, so you make more money. Like
mhm,
you can forget anything to do with integrity if you're going to
yeah,
incentivize financially one of the sides. Like when hospitals were getting all kinds of, for example, hospitals during 2020 were getting like for every COVID patient, they
yeah,
got like X number of dollars more. Like every hospital had a million like COVID patients. Not that they weren't overwhelmed. I know people in the field medically, like a lot of them were, especially in bigger cities. But you're now like, holy shit, we can get a lot of money if we just cook these books a little and no one's checking.
mhm,
Again, that did happen, but also happens in a lot of places and in a lot of ways, all kinds of different situations and scenarios.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and just to expand on that a little bit too, because the what you're sharing here is this whole piece around being able to get into the battlefield and build a connection with the people so they can see that you're trying to serve a good purpose. But now, with kind of the evolution of what we're seeing in technology, you're seeing a lot of drones going in and just dropping bombs, right? Or just shooting. So you're losing that ability to embed yourself and talk to the locals and explain the role you're playing. Do you see an issue with that, or that's not an issue from
I'm
your
definitely
perspective?
not an expert on that, But I will say you're
Yeah.
always gonna have psychological warfare, what we call psyops, psychological operations. World War II, they would drop these little pamphlets and leaflets out of airplanes down over Nazi occupied France to let the French people know Americans are here, there is hope, and to build people's
Yeah.
spirits and their belief, things like that. There's different modes of that same thing nowadays. I don't know if you're talking about in a particular war zone, but if you're in a war zone, you'll never be able to neglect having needing to have a psychological influence because again, you can bomb the hell out of the enemy, but if the people around it watching it don't know why it's happening or what's the reason that is justified and helps them, they're going to think, wow, these planes with American flags or whatever, these drones, it's just, they're just doing this. So you always have to have a reason, a narrative, and you're always trying to convince people that your reason is just and good and to their benefit and they should support you. Even if you're Hitler, it's like he was doing it. And it doesn't,
Yeah.
again, it doesn't even matter as far as the effectiveness of it, it doesn't matter how good or bad and evil your cause is. Those who have the most powerful, compelling message consistently are going to win. Because if you want to win wars, you want to win everything in life, you win people's minds. You win their minds, then you can get them on your side. Do you know how hard it is to go into a foreign country and convince people against a long established regime that they might depend on?
Right.
The Taliban had this idea. They would tell the people, they would tell the villagers as a fear tactic, they would say, hey, the Americans have the clock, but we have the time. And what that meant was, look, one
Mhm.
day America's going to leave this place. And when they do, we're still going to be here. And if you help them,
Right.
your family's going to pay for it when we get the chance. So there's that fear narrative, but it's
Yeah.
which is more believable. What people believe tends to become. It tends to evolve into
Mhm.
things, whether it's an invention or I'll never go anywhere or do anything. Nobody would ever hire me versus I'm one of the best at what I do. Of course they would hire me. They just need to know me. Now I'm going to go meet a bunch of them and I'm going to keep helping them until they hire me. Like
Mhm.
it's all belief.
Yeah.
It's all what you think, and then it materializes. I think that's how I have wild theories. I think that's like maybe somewhere how life came to be, in some way. I don't know,
Yeah.
but I have an idea. It's connected somewhere to something like that.
I agree. I think it's what you're sharing there is you need to have a compelling story. And when we look back at history, there's certain stories that have survived the test of time, right? Because they're compelling enough and it can allow you to buy into the message,
Mhm.
right? So maybe talking about that now, because we've talked about all the ways there can be manipulative messaging and propaganda. And you talked about certain personality traits. There's that dark tetrad side of things with psychopaths, narcissists,
Mhm.
Machiavellian. You can sell a message, you can be charming, you can get people to buy into what you're saying. But how do you then go to the other side and have effective messaging where, to your point earlier, you want to do good things and you want people to also believe what you're sharing? And when you're trying to do it in the business world, what are some things people can focus on when it comes to that
Yeah,
effective
the first
messaging?
thing is to be clear. Is to be simple.
Mm.
If it takes 32 words to say what your big idea is, you don't understand it, and no one's going to get it. But again, I use this example only because it's a good example. President Trump, his whole campaign is 4 words: "Make America Great Again,"
Mhm.
or "Keep America Great." I think is they did that too with the variation.
Yeah.
Everything comes out of that. So many companies I consult with or do copywriting with, if I go and I ask every single one of their employees, "What does your company do?" If there's 50 employees, I get 50 different answers. What now? Here's an example of working with somebody like me. I'm not trying to pitch myself, but I will go in and I will help them clarify and define what their one message is, like in 4 to 6 words, 4 to 7 words, and then from that create a very tight, like 1 or 2 sentence line that everybody can easily memorize. Imagine 50 radio stations talking about the same company, but one's talking about them like they're a banana export company out of Argentina. and this one, they're a marketing company from Russia. And there's all these confusing messages, like you're putting marketing dollars into everything, blasting it, but it's a loud, noisy, confusing message. There's bombs going off everywhere. There's static on the radio as you're trying to talk to people. Whereas if you go to gruntcopy.com, that's my copywriting website for my copywriting services. My headline says this. It says, I write words that make your company more money. It says, that's the first thing you see in big gold letters with my picture next to it. I'm not even saying I'm a copywriter. I'm just like, it's like, what do I do that helps you? It's, I write words that make your company more money. That's easy for everyone to understand. What's he do? Oh, he writes words, then it makes companies money. And so it's that simple. So clarifying what that message is, and then really giving people something simple enough where instead of them coming up with their own way of telling everyone what it is, you give them a sentence or two. And then everyone memorizes. That way, now if 50 of your employees are on a radio station and the radio says, hey, tell everyone what your company does, they're all saying the right thing consistently, and it's the same thing. That is powerful because it's clear, it's not confusing. It's not a bunch of radio static on a radio while you're going, hey, what'd you say? And there's bombs going off because it's noisy. It's like crystal clear, like you're hearing my voice right now. Bombs going off in static versus the clarity of my voice into this Shure SM7B ridiculously expensive microphone I'm using. But there's a reason it sounds so good. It's because it's quality. And the message can go out as quality because it's right. Yeah, so like whatever you're doing, and whatever, if it's your business or if it's like a cause, you need to clarify things. You need to hand people the very few simple elements they need to go out and evangelize with that. Because people understand simple and clear. If it's simple, people get it.
Yeah. Yeah, and one of the other things you touched on when we chatted previously was standing firm. Why is that important in your messaging and communication?
Yeah, when I talk about standing firm, it's more about personal resilience. I have a keynote speech I've been given for 16 plus years. It's about my war story, but more so about it's my war story plus the 90% of that speech is like what I learned through it and how it applies to your life to help you win your battles. So it's not just me talking about my injury, but that keynote speech is called How to Stand Firm When Everything Around You is Blowing Up. Now, I could say a bunch of different things, and before I knew how to write that well, I did say a bunch of things. I could use the whole overcome adversity, which every motivational speaker out there is using that. It's like it's common language. But you've got how to stand firm when everything around you is blowing up. And the guy talking about it has been inside of 2 vehicles that were blown up when he was inside of it. So it's like, well, this guy knows what it's literally like to have life blowing up. That's not most people's battle, thank God. But you know what? You lose a loved one, you lose a marriage, you lose a business, you lose money, you lose your job. That is a literal battle. Like you're getting blown up somewhere. There is a battle. And so standing firm, it's like with that particular message, I looked at what people throughout history who went through like the worst shit I could find and like how did they get through it and come back and thrive in life. I looked historically. I looked at myself because I came back pretty quick from that, relatively speaking. And a lot of my friends didn't. And I'm not a better person. So I was like, when people are asking me, how did you bounce back so fast? I actually didn't know. And it really made me mad because they're trying to help themselves or someone else. And I didn't really have anything to give them. So I would look at other friends of mine who bounced back and I would look and just go, what do we all have in common? What are like 3 or 5 or 7 things that we're all doing or that we were all thinking this way? And that's where that message of how to stand firm when everything around you is blowing up came from. It's about the key things that the world's most resilient people do to come back from devastating adversity.
Yeah. And what are those things?
Right? Yeah, there's 3 core tenets. There's many things, number one, but I broke it down into 3. Three M's: meaning, mentoring, and a mission. So the first time I spoke on stage, I was only a few months out of the hospital. I didn't realize I was going to be yanked up on stage in front of 3,000 people. I was still in burn bandages. My face was still and neck was still somewhat pink from the second-degree burns. My hands were wrapped in those burn bandages from the skin grafts of the third-degree burns. And I spoke for 2 minutes. Just, hey, I'm still here for a reason. There's a plan for all this. I don't know. Don't give up.
Mm.
Go for it. Probably the worst motivational speech you ever heard. But when I got off
Yeah.
stage, this lady walked up to me and she said, "Hey, Brian, ever since I was a little girl, I was raped and abused and molested literally hundreds of times from the time of being a child through teen years." And she was in her mid 20s at that point. And she said, "My boyfriend broke up with me recently. He was abusive." And she said, "2 weeks ago, I tried to kill myself and I failed." That's what she said to me at the time I
Mm.
met her. And I had no idea what to say. What do you say to someone like that? But then she said
Yeah.
this. She said, "If you can get through all that," referring to my war experience and my injury, she said, "I think I can get through this." And that was a sense of meaning that came into my life because I thought, with as bad as this all was, it led me to being right here and this person getting some sort of hope out of seeing me continue to fight my own battle. She's not going to go home and put a pistol in her mouth tonight or drink a bottle of pills. And that was meaningful to me. And I didn't understand exactly what that was until I read Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, one of the best books ever written. If you haven't read it, go read it.
Yeah.
And he said about suffering, he said, in some ways, suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds a meaning. In some ways, suffering
Mhm.
ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds a meaning. To put it shortly, I found an intense amount of meaning in my suffering when I met that lady. So people say, "Oh, Brian, you helped her." Good, I'm glad. I didn't mean to. But she helped me and I didn't know it. And she didn't know it. So there was that sense of meaning.
Right.
I'm just talking from my own personal experience.
Yeah.
At that time, I had just met my mentor, a guy who was an injured Vietnam veteran who came home horribly injured, and he became an author and speaker. And he had been doing that for, gosh, what, 35 years at the point I met him? Still is doing it, very successful. And he mentored me into sharing my story to help people, how to share my story in a way that helps the world. And so it was helpful for me, it was helpful for people, and I had someone guiding me down a path, showing me a way. It's Luke Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi in Star Wars. Luke is young and wants to do something, but he doesn't know how, and Obi-Wan knows the way because he is a Jedi. So if you want to be a Jedi, maybe talk to the Jedi. And so he leads him. It's that kind of parallel. So that's a
Yeah.
mentorship, like following someone who already knows how to do what you're trying to do. And then the mission. I discovered a higher mission in my life when I met that young lady. My mentor, Dave, I told him that evening after that happened with the girl. I said, "I don't know what happened today, but I have to do this. I don't know how to do this. I didn't
Mhm.
know anyone does do this, public speaking, but I'm going to do this or die trying. Will you help me?" I had something came out of me like that I didn't know was there that I had to do. And that became my next life mission. So many people fall off the wagon, especially getting out of the military, because you're institutionalized as far as the lifestyle of the military. That's quite different from the civilian world. And one big mistake that military men and women make when they get out of the military is they don't have their next mission very clearly defined with where they're going, what's going to happen, what's the next mission, what's the next plan. We know all this stuff, but nobody teaches us to apply it to our personal lives.
Right.
So for me, again,
Mhm.
standing firm when everything around you is blowing up, this is just my experience, but I've seen it true with other people's too. It's having a sense of meaning in what you're going through, having a mentor to help guide you, and having a mission bigger than yourself that you're living for the accomplishment of. People who have all three of those, you don't see them in a really bad place mentally most of the time. But if you're missing
Yeah.
one or more of those, it can really affect you. So, yeah, I've been teaching people for 15, 16 years just how to look at your life and put that together. And the thing about it is, if you
Mhm.
look at the battle plan framework, those points I talked about earlier, if you do those, it accomplishes those three things. And I didn't even realize it when I created that one page battle plan template, but it actually accomplishes those three things.
Yeah, and I appreciate you sharing that because I think so many people I talk to on this podcast, and myself included, when you're able to go through those difficult situations and find meaning, that often can translate into your purpose or your mission, as you're sharing here, because now you have the skills where you can help others. And while it's important to have a mentor who can guide you, you can then also become a mentor to other people who might be struggling in similar
Yes.
ways. So there's so much profundity to that, because then that suffering no longer feels like suffering because you see something powerful coming out of it. And I think that's a beautiful way of illustrating it. There's one more thing you touched on that I am curious to know, because there's a lot of, again, criticism and narrative around whether or not, depending on whatever country you're in, when often veterans come back, they really struggle, like you said, to integrate because they haven't figured out what that next chapter of their life is going to look like. But then there's criticism around, is the country doing enough to support these individuals? And then you see stories like you got homeless people that were at one point in the military, or they're veterans. What goes on there? Like, where's the disconnect when you hear these
Okay, yes.
narratives?
So, for example, like you're saying, like the transition out of the military, the struggle into civilian life,
Yeah.
it's a real struggle. There are tons of programs that do exist for that, especially since 9/11, post 9/11
Yeah.
war on terror veterans, that really revealed like a need for more programs for that purpose. So it's twofold. There is a need for that. I think an ever expanding need. But at the same time, it's weird to me how many guys I meet, and by guys, veterans, they could be men and women, but
Yeah.
it's like they were trained to fight at an elite level and accomplish, and they were stellar for 4 years. And then they get out and it's they just forget everything they were taught. And it's if you're not at least willing to work and pick yourself up, and where's that tenacity you were taught to have that you had for those years in the military? And then you got out and you unlearned it or got lazy or whatever it was. And it's not that everyone who fails and struggles is lazy. I'm not saying that. Everyone's situation can be different. Okay. But there has to be a combination of programs that help people get back on there and stay on their feet. And then there's the personal thing of getting off your ass and doing something. You can't make a person have that. So like it's a twofold thing. I think America's doing
Yeah.
more now. My country is doing more now than they ever have for their veterans. Not just the government, but nonprofits, private sector stuff. There is so much. You can't be an American veteran and walk around saying there's no help and nobody will help you. There's 10,000 organizations, if you throw a rock 5 feet in any direction, that exist. And if they can't help you, they know 10,000 more organizations that can and will. But it's like I don't know where this sense of helplessness comes from. I don't know. Like, I'm not being non compassionate because there is a struggle, there is a transition period, but it comes down to you doing something and also utilizing the resources available. But I think a big piece of that is that when you leave the military, you lose a big support structure. You had basically all your needs met so you could do the job. You had a strong, dedicated teams that you were a part of every day. You lived with them, you trained with them, you fought alongside them. There's loyalty, there's like all this, and you get out, and then there's these people who are civilians who a lot of times couldn't
Right.
give a shit less about you or each other. They'll stab each other in the back. There's no loyalty. It would seem. I'm not saying honest people don't exist. They do, but in general, like that's the experience you get, and you're just like, what the hell? Like, where's the camaraderie? Where's the team? Where's everyone who's here for each other? And they're not. And you're like, for the first time in your life after the military, you are now on a new battlefield and you are alone, which I said earlier is the worst place you can be
Yeah.
is alone on a battlefield by default of getting out of the military. So that's where you have to start grabbing the allies, the resources, making a plan. And it's a big part of it's on you. Also, using the resources and making sure those are there. And I would say the same thing
Yeah.
for the Canadian military, who we fought alongside in Afghanistan. You guys were right there with us. There was the British, and a lot of the common stories are the same among our countries.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Thank you for building on that. Now, one last thing. I know we talked about propaganda and how it's easy to fall into that trap. and we've talked about effective communication. But from your perspective, what can people do to become more aware and test their own blind spots and biases so they're a bit more aware around what's the messaging they're absorbing and just having that kind of objective view on things rather than falling into extremes as we were talking about earlier?
This is something it seems a lot of people don't like to do, and it's called intelligent critical thinking. Here's an example. I would encourage you, next time you hear a message that pisses you off or it rubs you wrong, someone makes a statement in the 1800s, it would have been about slavery. In the
Yeah.
1940s, it would have been about the Nazis. Or even back in the 50s, it would have been about homosexuals. Pick your enemy of the day. Someone says something in support of something you don't like, you don't have to agree with it, obviously. But ask yourself, why do I disagree? Why does that rub me the wrong way? Because you probably have a belief about that thing that you've been taught you're supposed to have about that thing. And a lot of times, if you dig down into it, you might still be against it and have your reasons. That's fine. But you might also find you're not as against it as you were taught to be. And then you start realizing sometimes that what you were taught was good and noble was actually, in a way, propaganda that was serving a purpose, and it was using you. I grew up very conservative Christian, and I'm not in that boat anymore. I'm still a good person. I believe in higher stuff. I have my big questions, but I say that to say this.
Mm-hmm.
I was raised in a place where you don't associate with someone who's homosexual. Like, you don't even look at, don't talk. And it's, if you see them, it's just steer clear. They're weird. They're like, I think this narrative that was just pushed on me. But then I started meeting some of these people. And it's, oh, that one piece of it was, one piece of propaganda was they say they're born that way, but they're not. They're choosing to, quote, live in sin, according to that. Then I started talking to
Mm-hmm.
them, and one, they're just like me. Why wouldn't they be? Number two, I had one of my friends go, I said, were you born gay, or how was that? And he goes, friend, let me ask you this. Did you choose to like women, or were you just born that way? I said, I was just born that way. Yeah, I didn't choose to like it. He goes, okay, I was just born this way. And I didn't choose that. It wasn't a conscious decision. I'm just, he goes, even since I was like 7 or 8 years old, I didn't even know what sex was. I've been attracted to other men. I didn't do anything. It's just how, yeah. But the narrative that was pushed into me was that they're choosing it, and they're sickos and they're weirdos and stay away. They'll try to do things with you. Trust me, the average gay guy I've met has higher standards than women. The average guy has nothing to worry about being around gay guys. They have way higher standards of, yeah, you're actually not what he would pick. But that's my point, though. There's what I was taught I was supposed to think. And then I questioned it, and I looked at it. I did my own research. I met the people, got to know them, and I was like, hey, but they don't mind if I'm my way. We're not.
Right.
But it's the us and them you went back to. And it's, if you
Yes.
want power and control, you have to create us and them, and then go to war and conquer and destroy, and it hurts everybody, collateral damage, all that shit. When it's, as humans, I don't think we don't know how to not do that. But that's, to answer your question everything. Question what you, growing up religious, I was taught not to question. How deviant, how manipulative.
Yeah.
Don't question it, even though it sounds like bullshit. Don't question it. And if you
Right.
do, we're all going to turn our backs on you. And they did, when I wasn't even disagreeing. I was just asking intelligent questions that I was following where it went. And boy, when people get really enraged and pissed off when you're just asking questions, here's your sign. Like, red flags, more than like a communist Chinese parade, more red flags than that, man. It's like, why are people mad that I'm asking questions? So think about that. And just, if something rubs you the wrong way, ask yourself why, and dig into it. Think about it. And does it really rub you the wrong way, or were you taught to be rubbed the wrong way by it? Again, this could be true, or it could be false. It could be a really bad thing in the world. For me, there is a small population of people I've heard who like referring to themselves as, quote, minor attracted people. Now, in my world, I call them child molesters and pedophiles. If you're attracted sexually to a 5-year-old, I have a problem with you, and I'll never not be that way.
Yeah.
But you can't like dumb this down and go, see, that's where I draw the line, something like that.
Yeah.
But if it's like,
Right.
oh, this guy he was just born liking guys. I'm like, I was born liking girls. At least I thought all the way down into it. I'm not just being strung along by a narrative, by propaganda. I thought down into it. I looked at both sides. I was critical of both sides, and I can see the full battlefield now, the full picture, not just the piece I was taught to see.
Yeah. Yeah. And another point I think you're touching on when we talk about propaganda too is this false sense of belonging. And that in religious institutions, you see that on like the political spectrum. And you see this how gang members recruit vulnerable teenage
Hmm.
boys, right? It's like you've never felt like you belonged, but here's a sense of belonging.
It's an easy sell.
And yeah, and it's how the herd mentality works, right? And I think that's part of that whole propaganda is if you share these beliefs, now you belong. And for people that are seeking that, they're a little bit more vulnerable and fall into that trap. So I can definitely see that as well. Brian, thank you so much for this enlightening conversation. I really appreciate everything you've shared. You've obviously shared a lot of things for people to take back and not only focus on from their perspective of communicating, but also not to fall into certain traps. So I definitely appreciate that. Now, for listeners that want to learn more about you and find your work online, what are some ways they can do that?
Yeah, if you just go to gruntcopy.com, GRUNTCOPY, gruntcopy.com, that's my website for the copywriting and the messaging things I do with marketing and creating messages that sell, creating messages that convince people to do things. And hey, trust me, I don't work with everybody. If I believe your thing is like bad, like I'm not writing stuff to convince people towards you. I do have a personal standard, but yeah, I like working with businesses. I like working with like nonprofit causes who have a mission, like they exist to serve and believe in that helps people. I love writing stuff that really helps people when a business has that. So yeah, if you go to gruntcopy.com, you can find me there and connect with me there as well. And on Instagram,
All
if you
right.
put in
Well,
grunt copy, that's also me.
all right. We'll put that in the show notes. But thank you again, Brian. This was a
Hey, thanks for
pleasure.
having me on. You've been a great host today. Great questions. I'm so grateful that you prepared so well to make this the episode it was. So thank you.
Yeah, no, takes two.